Do you ever try to manipulate or control God's promises? My name is Carrie, and I'm going through a 4-week series on the promises of God leading up to Christmas. And I talked last week about stepping out into God's promises. I talked week 1 about believing God's promises. And today I want to talk about the hardest one for me, which is waiting on God's promises. And for some of us, we have to focus on maybe last week on trusting God enough to act on what he wants us to do, to act even before we see his hand, even before we see his miracle, to step up into our battle and believe that God's showing up. But for others of us, I think we struggle with a slightly different problem. And maybe some of us are like, you know what? I am ready, God. I was born ready. And if you want me to give away all my clothes and sell my house, I will do it. And if you want me to move to China, great. Consider it done. Just tell me what you want to do and I will do it. And then we will see your promise and all will be good. And I think for some of us that this eagerness is such a beautiful thing. It's a good thing. But without realizing it, if we aren't careful, our excitement to act on God's promises can shift from trusting in God to trusting in what we're doing. And Galatians 3:3 cautions us against this. It says, after beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? In other words, we can start out wanting to serve God and wanting to follow him and act on his commands, which is good. But we should not let that become us acting on our own strength and trying to complete God's promises without him, right? Because that's a dangerous place to be. And it reminds me of this passage in Psalm 106, where the psalmist is talking about how God brought the Israelites out of Egypt. And it says that he saved them for his name's sake. It says he rebuked the Red Sea and it dried up, and he led them through the depths as through a desert. He saved them from their enemies. Their waters covered their adversaries. Not one of them survived. And verse 12 says, then they believed his promises and sang his praise. And it's this reminder again of, okay, they saw God work. They saw God do something that only he could do. And as a result, they believed him and they praised him. And I wish it ended there, but it didn't. And in verse 13, it turns sour. It says, but they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his plan to unfold. And verse 24 takes it a step further and says, then they despised the pleasant land. They did not believe his promise. And so I think two things happen when God puts us in a waiting period. Like these Israelites were in this waiting wilderness season, and somehow in that time they managed to get amnesia basically, and they thought to themselves, well, God has never done a single good thing for us apparently, and he's not going to show up. And what happened is they did not wait for his plan to unfold, and they forgot everything that he had already done for them. They did not believe his promise anymore. And maybe this is something that you can relate to. Maybe you've been waiting so long that you also have started to get a little bit of amnesia and we've forgotten what God has already done for us. And maybe it's caused you to doubt God's promise or doubt what he's done. And maybe it's caused you to try to take matters into your own hands. And this reminds me of Abraham and Sarah. In Genesis 16, God says that Abraham was this man of God, right? God actually says that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. So he's this amazing man of faith, and he has this relationship with God simply because of his belief. And every step of the journey, God shows up for them, for Abraham and for Sarah. And God gives them promises. And he says to them, I'm going to make you a great nation. All the nations on earth are going to be blessed through you, and your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And this was a problem because Abraham and Sarah at that time did not have any children, and they were getting older. And it turns out that God gave the promise, but then he decided to wait and take his sweet time to fulfill that promise for a good reason, but they couldn't see that. And so the longer that they waited, the more they began to doubt his promise, and they stopped waiting for his plan to unfold. And Sarah, much like me, I start to think at some point, if I'm looking around the house and I think, oh my gosh, okay, if no one else is going to do this, I'm going to just have to do it because I'm going to take matters into my own hands and get this thing done. And I think maybe that's what Sarah felt like. Okay, God, I believe that you had a promise, that you had this idea, but clearly you're not really in any position or any mood to finish this promise quickly. So why don't we just take care of it my way? And she decided to give Abraham her maidservant Hagar to sleep with him. And she said, well, maybe God wants the promise to be fulfilled this way. Why not? Right? This makes logical human sense, since I can't have kids, really. So she does. And Abraham and Hagar do have a child together. And ultimately, that decision to deviate from God's plan, to not wait for his plan to unfold, to stop believing his promise, caused so much heartache and grief. When all along, God was preparing this promise, this miracle, and he wanted to give Abraham and Sarah this little baby Isaac. Even though Abraham, it says, was as good as dead, and Sarah was well past childbearing years, God had a miracle. He had a promise and he was going to fulfill it, but they needed to wait. They needed to rest in that. And the truth is that God always is doing something, even when we can't see. And there are things that he does in our waiting period that he could not accomplish otherwise. And one of those things really is, it has to do with us. Part of it is simply growing our trust in him, growing our faith, growing our perseverance in prayer. I know God reminded me recently, he said, Carrie, if I gave you this answer months ago, would you have prayed? Would you have been faithful in prayer like this? And I thought, no, to be honest, I would not have been faithful in prayer. I would not have learned to rest in God and ask him for things over and over again, to persevere in that. The other thing is God wants us to remember. And so one thing I've had to learn is to go back to this board I created. It's called my Ebenezer board. And I started pinning up pictures of all the good things that God has done for me this past year, whether it's answered prayer or blessings that I was not even expecting. And so for me now in this waiting, it's also a time for me to be intentional about remembering every good thing that God has done, the ways that he has shown up, like parting the water for me, the things that I could never have done on my own strength. And so this waiting period is a time for us to remember God, to remember his goodness, and to remember who he is and his faithfulness. So I would encourage you this week, if you are in a waiting period, if you just do not know what God is doing, hold on. Hold on. Be faithful in prayer. Be patient in affliction. Do not give up, because God wants to do something, and it may not look just like what you thought, but he will absolutely do something that is so far beyond what you could accomplish in your own strength. So thank you for tuning in. Next week, we'll be talking about embracing God's promises. I can't wait.